Okay, so figure 1 isn't so much a data task, but it just illustrates what kind of things you perhaps could be thinking about if you see this type of thing. So the idea that triglycerides are found in food, so fatty foods contain triglycerides as part of the lipid molecules. So these triglycerides need to be hydrolyzed into fatty acids and glycerol. In this case, the fatty acids are then taken to cells via the blood, and they're used for 3 different things by the cells. You need to be able to use your biological knowledge to understand why. So why can they be used to make plasma membranes? Because phospholipid bilayers, phospholipids require 2 fatty acids combined with a phosphate and glycerol. So the fatty acids can be used to make phospholipids, which are needed for the bilayer. Fats can also be used as part of respiration as a respiratory substrate. And why they're particularly full of energy? Because they've got lots of carbon-hydrogen bonds. When you do respiration next year, you'll understand why that's important. And then they can be converted to other fatty acids. So you know about saturated and unsaturated fatty acids, and some of those have different properties, can be used in slightly different ways. So they can be converted to other fatty acids which might have a particular purpose. If we're going to look at this graph, sometimes there's some really important points in the words of the resource as well. This lets us know that some cows were moved from eating grass in fields to eating corn in cattle sheds. So 2 things here. There's lots of variables involved here, which if we have an evaluate, you could use sort of against points and evaluate. So one thing, they're going from eating grass to eating corn, so that's one independent variable that's changing, but also they're going from fields to cattle sheds. So there's all sorts of other things that could be factored in here. So fields are outside with higher light intensity, more space. In cattle sheds there's less space, artificial light, and all these things, hopefully you're aware of, can affect an organism, how it grows, how it behaves. If you're going to describe this data, you can't just say that as time increases, or as time goes on, the mean omega-3 drops. You can't say that, because if you did, that would just imply you've got a linear decrease, you've got a proportional decrease, which you don't. So if you're going to describe this graph, you'd say you have a steep decrease up to 40 days. So you can see that's a steep decrease there to 40 days, and then a gradual decrease, which then levels off after 140 days. So that implies steep and levels off after 140 days. Looking at this as well, we've got some important units here. So you might have, it's in the front of the AO3 booklet, so this is as percentage of the total fat in the milk. So percentage of something, that immediately alerts you to that it allows comparison. And why does it allow comparison? We'll look at what we're measuring. So we're measuring the total fat in the milk, and we'll look at the omega-3. So different cows will have different proportions of omega-3, and the amount of omega-3 varies in the milk. So that is why you have to use a percentage, because each cow will have different amounts of omega-3 as an actual concentration, so it allows comparison. And because the fat content varies from cow to cow. So if you're going to evaluate this, so does eating corn cause a decrease in mean omega-3? So immediately look at this and think yes, because you do have a negative correlation. So as this increases, this decreases. So there is negative correlation. But there's also lots of other things which would go against this point. So first of all, I can't see any standard deviations on here. It is a mean, so it could have standard deviation bars on each of these. So there's no standard deviation. There's no statistical test being carried out to prove that it is a significant correlation. Also, there's no control group, so there's no group that were fed on corn, but they were still outside. So other factors, so no control group, it might have fallen anyway, but there could be other factors that could have caused the increase, the decrease. So it could be the fact that they're now inside rather than in a field. So it could be other factors that causes this decrease. And another thing, this was only one investigation. Nowhere in here does it tell you how many investigations it was, how many cows were used. So it's only one investigation, so it might not be representative of all cows up and down the country or in the world. So if you see a cause, in a question, it usually leads you along the line of the standard answer in the booklet, correlation and causation. And we can see that when I described it, that yes, you do have negative correlation, but that does not mean that one thing causes the other thing to happen. So that doesn't mean that time spent on corn causes the mean omega-3 to fall. You then need to look at the data and try and argue against the fact you've got negative correlation. What other evidence is there? And can you think of any other factors that could have resulted in that decrease? This graph is a bit more involved. I do want to see people annotating graphs. There's a lot you can get from this, and it's highly likely that you will get an evaluate question with this. So lots of things spring out from this. So what can we conclude from this then? What does this graph tell us? So please annotate all around your graphs when you get these types of things before you start the questions. What does this tell you? So if you're going to compare whether farmed was better than wild, or wild was better than farmed in terms of mean omega-3, what conclusions can we draw from this? So first of all, let's just look at salmon. So comparing farmed and wild, and we can see that you've got more omega-3, you've got a higher mean, because that bar goes across, you've got a higher mean in farmed salmon than you do in wild salmon. So try and use comparative language, so higher mean than in wild. So that would go along with the idea that farmed produces more omega-3. It's the same for the rainbow trout. You've got a higher mean here than you do here. So that goes along with the argument as well, that you've got more omega-3 in farmed. And you can see in both means that's the case. However, we can see that we've got standard deviation bars on here. And if you have standard deviation bars, you have to use them. So let's look at rainbow trout. The bottom of the bar here and the top of the bar there do not overlap. So there's a big space in between the two where the bottom of that does not overlap with the top of that bar. So there's no overlap, and what that tells us is that you have a significant difference. So there is significantly more omega-3 in farmed rainbow trout than in wild rainbow trout. So that would go along with the argument that there is more in farmed. Let's look at salmon though. It's not the case with salmon. The bottom of this bar here, standard deviation bar, overlaps with the top of that standard deviation bar. So if you ran this across, it would actually be above the bottom of that bar. So there is an overlap in standard deviations. That shows that you do not have a significant difference. So farmed does not significantly increase the amount of omega-3. So that's an against point against that argument. There's another against point. If you're going to generalise that farmed produces more omega-3, then you'd hope it'd be with every single species. And there's actually an overlap between the two different species. In fact, the means are the same as well. There are other against points as well. Going with the standard deviations, an even better thing to do would be to do a statistical test. That would allow you to see to what level of probability that the difference is due to chance. So there's no statistical test carried out either. So that's something to look at when evaluating a question. Has the statistical test been carried out? In this case, no. So that means you cannot prove that the difference was due to chance. Another thing that leaps out here is the sample sizes. So some of the sample sizes are only 10. That's a very small sample size. So that the standard answer in the front of your booklets would be, this is not representative. So you do not know if this is the true representative value that represents all salmon. We don't know if this represents all rainbow trout or wild rainbow trout. So a small sample size is not representative. That's another against point in an argument. Another thing that's probably not a part of an argument, but as a question that could come up, is we've got here units per 100 grams, so mean omega-3 per 100 grams. So why that's important is it allows comparison again. Why? That's a gram, so that's mass, because each fish could be a different mass. So you can't compare a huge fish with a small fish and just have the raw mass of omega-3, because you would expect there to be more omega-3 in the bigger fish. So you have to make it per 100 grams to make it comparable. Another point on standard deviation bars, what does the standard deviation bar show? Well, standard deviation shows the spread around the mean. So you can see here, this is the smallest spread around the mean, so that this set of data, more of the rainbow trout have mean omega-3s that are closer to the mean values. There's less spread around mean, there's less variation in that sample.